Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 11 wide receiver starter sits for the 2019 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about news around the National Football League, a lot of injury news going into Week 11, then going into my matchups at the wide receiver position, kind of giving you guys some perspective on who has the best and worst matchups going into the week, then going over my top 36 wide receiver rankings on the week. Before we begin today's episode, let me remind all of you, if you haven't yet already, click the subscribe button, join the community, click the bell notification button to stay up to date, and if you like today's video, make sure you click that like button. Hey everybody, how's it going? All right, so couple pieces of news that we need to go over right off the top. Jacoby Brissett, according to Frank Wright, head coach of the Indianapolis Colts, will be playing this week. He practiced today, so there will be no Brian Hoyer. So Zach Pascal, Eric Ebron, Marlon Mack, they are all upgrades from where they were sitting at the moment. But all in all, it's a good situation to see that Jacoby Brissett is not going to miss a significant amount of time. Outside of that, guys that could be missing significant amounts of time, Austin Hooper, according to what has been said from the MRI and everything of that sort, it's an MCL sprain, and he's likely to miss a month. That's really unfortunate, especially if you were an Austin Hooper owner. The guy was having the best season of his career, and he was having the best season amongst all tight ends, which was really exciting to see. But unfortunately, that is going to stop for now. He will return eventually later in the season, hopefully, when healthy. But until then, we're going to be out. One of the top tight ends in the landscape, which is definitely unfortunate. Moving on, other pieces of information. Tyler Lockett, who missed for majority of that second half of that game, who stayed in a hospital after that night. A lot of bruising on his leg. According to what we've heard from the organization, he's healthy. He's back to Seattle, and he shouldn't be missing much time, if at all. So that's good to hear. Emmanuel Sanders, also, who missed time in that game, due to that rib injury, is set to potentially miss a couple weeks. Same thing with Matt Breida. Matt Breida could potentially miss 1 to 2 weeks. Same thing with Emmanuel Sanders. So that is not good for the 49ers offense, but it is good for other players that have kind of stepped up into a new role, aka Deebo Samuel. We talked about him on Sunday. I had him at like my number 20-something ranked wide receiver, and he produced really well because of the absence of Kittle. So if in fact we're going to see an absence of Emmanuel Sanders as well, again, he had 8 catches for 112, so it'll be a definite boost in his direction going forward, a guy that's not very much owned in fantasy leagues. Moving on outside of that, a couple players coming off IR in the coming weeks. Devin Funchess for the Indianapolis Colts, which is definitely something that we could eventually go back and pick him up, because right now there's no T.Y. Hilton. Zach Pascal is technically the number one, even though he doesn't get any targets for some reason when Brian Hoyer is at quarterback. And then we'll obviously Jacoby Brissett coming back. Devin Funchess will be the number one, and Pascal will move to the number two. So we'll see exactly what kind of situation we have there. There's a potential he could play this week, but I doubt that at this moment in time. But again, you never know. As the week progresses, different things come out, and different players are at different stages of their recovery. Moving on. John Ross for the Cincinnati Bengals will be coming off IR as well, another one of these receivers that can come back and contribute for his team. They have a lot of wide receivers there. If, in fact, A.J. Green is to come back as well, they have a lot of wide receivers with a lot of talent in that offense, which is exactly what this offense was kind of built around. The head coach of that team was the quarterback coach or the offensive coordinator for the Rams? He kind of wanted to run that Ram scheme where you have 3 wide receiver sets, you have that one singular running back, a couple tight ends come in, Uzama and Eifert, and you can run a similar scheme to that, but haven't really able to got into that because the talent at the wide receiver position is always getting hurt, which is unfortunate, but we'll see where that goes. And also the last player coming off of IR would be David Njoku in the coming weeks, which is a huge security blanket for Baker Mayfield, so hopefully that can go ahead and go in the right direction. He can return and help out his offense. All right, moving on. And now that we've kind of covered over all that news, let's go and talk about the matchups at the wide receiver position going into Week 11 of the fantasy football season. Starting off with some of the easier matchups, defenses that give up the most points to opposing wide receivers in half-point PPR scoring formats. It's no surprise that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are the worst defense around the National Football League in the secondary. Not only are they terrible, but they cut Vernon Hargreaves, their former first-round pick, earlier this week. A guy that, yes, he was struggling all season long, but he was a first-round pick. They cut him outright. Don't want anything to do with him anymore. He's gone. which is pretty unfortunate considering he was a young talent and could have potentially, really stepped up over the years. But, nothing really went in his direction, was cut. We'll see what happens with that. But again, this is a secondary and a defense that is bleeding, especially when you target them in the passing game. So that's definitely what the New Orleans Saints are going to take care of this week. Moving on, the Jets playing against Dwayne Haskins. Is there a good opportunity for Haskins to make some plays? Sure. McLaurin is the only receiving option that I trust in that offense as of right now. So I think, there's a good certainty that if in fact that bye week was used to get more experience, to get him on the right track, hopefully Dwayne Haskins can maybe produce something for his receivers around him. He himself is not a great fantasy option, but potentially the offense around him could be with Adrian Peterson or Darius Geis and Terry McLaurin. Moving on to Houston Texans, Lamar Jackson will be able to take advantage, and I'm sure Marquise Brown is excited for the matchup against that secondary, so that should be fun. The New York Giants are on a bye week. The Oakland Raiders will be taking on Cincinnati Bengals. Raiders secondary, again, they lost Carl Joseph this past week. They're stepping up. They got a good defense, but injuries have really hurt them this season, and especially in the secondary, and that's where they've struggled the most. So I do expect maybe Ryan Finley to get something done. I don't think he'll completely drop a goose egg, but again, you'll never know. He's a rookie quarterback in his second start ever. Moving on to Minnesota Vikings, struggling against wide receivers. That's not much of a surprise. Like I mentioned last week, Xavier Rhodes is kind of washed. Trey Waynes on the other side is not playing well. But will Brandon Allen and Courtland Sutton be able to take advantage of that? We'll talk about that in a little bit. The Atlanta Falcons always struggling against wide receivers. Even though they played well last week, they still let Michael Thomas do whatever he wanted. And I do think guys like Curtis Samuel, DJ Moore, who are trending in the correct direction with Kyle Allen, could be in line for a very big performance this week in the matchup. Moving on, the Eagles also struggling against wide receivers. Mohamed Sanu, Julian Edelman. That's all they want to do with in terms of that offense at the wide receiver position. Moving on, the Arizona Cardinals, we know how that goes. Deebo Samuel, like I was mentioning, could be a huge play this week. Maybe even Kendrick Bourne, if in fact Emmanuel Sanders continues to be out with said injury. And then the Carolina Panthers taking on the Falcons, a very high-scoring matchup in the NFC South. Should be fun, back and forth between the two teams. Unfortunately, they will be missing Devonta Freeman and Austin Hooper, but it'll be the Calvin Ridley, Julio Jones show, which I'm really excited about as an owner of both of those prospects. Moving on, let's talk about some of the tougher matchups now that we kind of passed the midline of this. Here we go. The Green Bay Packers are on a bye week. We don't have to worry about that. The Indianapolis Colts will take on Nick Foles. We'll see what he's really made of now that he's healthy and ready to go. And a lot of these receivers around him have gained a lot of experience. Going back to last season, DJ Chark wasn't even used in this offense. Dede Westbrook, yes, was the number one. Chris Conley was on the, he was a backup for the Kansas City Chiefs. Now that these guys have gained 10 weeks of experience, hopefully with Nick Foles coming back into the lineup, we can see even more production against the Indianapolis Colts defense, but it's going to be a tough one. The Chargers play tough against wide receivers, but Tyreek Hill, Sammy Watkins, Travis Kelce, they're going to be getting after them. Speaking of those guys, the Kansas City Chiefs defense in the secondary are pretty good. That's mainly because they give up a lot on the ground, and a lot of teams try to, stay balanced with them, but run heavy. Because we know that if you can keep the ball out of Patrick Mahomes' hands, you have the best chance of winning in that case. So that's why people run against them and don't really pass very often against them. Then we got the Buffalo Bills, obviously Tre'Davious White, great cornerback. They got a good secondary, and they're another team that sucks against the run. The 49ers have played well overall as a defense, but have gotten hurt as of late. The Chicago Bears in the secondary have been fine. A couple passes here and there to Kenny Golladay made his week last week, but regardless, moving on, the Denver Broncos, the Dallas Cowboys, and the New England Patriots as the last three teams in terms of giving up the least amount of points to wide receivers. Not much of a surprise. The secondary, the Patriots have had a very easy season all season long, and they have a good secondary in general. Stephon Gilmore is on the sub button for a reason. Dallas Cowboys defense in the secondary, really, they struggle against the run mainly. People don't really test the Awuzie too often, but even when they do, sometimes they don't really succeed. And then you obviously have the Denver Broncos with Chris Harris Jr. locking down just about anybody. So those are the matchups going into Week 11 at the wide receiver position. Now that we've covered all over that, we went over the news, we went over the matchups. Let's talk about the players, in my opinion, who who are going to be the top 36 wide receivers of the week. Again, rankings are always subject to change by Sunday morning, our 8:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time stream. I know I was late last week, but Jesus, man, I went on a tilt on Sunday, and the tilt is carried on. There's a reason why Austin Eckler wasn't in the rankings yesterday, and I thought Paul Perkins was still on the Giants on Monday. It's just been a giant tilt. I'm going to try not to tilt this episode, and we're starting off pretty well as of right now. So anyway, like I was mentioning, the rankings are subject to change, and by Sunday morning, probably some of these guys will have adjusted. Obviously, the Thursday night matchup between the Steelers and the Browns, all of those players will be gone by Sunday morning. But again, these rankings are definitely going to change. I always change my mind. New information, new statistics come out. I pick up a couple things here and there, a couple injury pieces of news, and it'll adjust the rankings accordingly. Obviously, whether it's offensive injuries or even defensive injuries, those make a pretty big difference, and weather issues, all that kind of jazz. But either way, let's talk about my top 12 wide receivers going into Week 11. Starting off with my number 1, Michael Thomas. Shouldn't be much of a surprise. Michael Thomas plays against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, again, a defense that gives up the most points to opposing wide receivers. Michael Thomas hasn't had a week in half PPR this season of less than 13 fantasy points. He has been absolutely incredible, and he is not slowing down whatsoever. The guy last week had 14 targets, 13 receptions, 152 receiving yards. He is unstoppable wide receiver. He is the best wide receiver in football, and he has the best matchup in Week 11. You can't ask for anything else other than that. So as of right now, it's a no-brainer at this point. Michael Thomas, he's my number 1. Moving on to number 2, Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill last week had the record for 2019, the most targets by a wide receiver this season. 19 targets, 11 receptions, had over 152 or 100. Well, I said 152 because of Michael Thomas, but he had 157 receiving yards and a touchdown. Patrick Mahomes was throwing the ball a lot in that game, but either way, Tyreek Hill has been really consistent this season. The volatility hasn't really been there. We've seen him with Matt Moore, with Patrick Mahomes now, produce very well. And in this matchup, he has feasted in the past. We have seen him have huge games against the secondary. Yes, they have good cornerbacks, certainly. But this kind of speed is just, it's too hard to defend at times. Especially when they start throwing all these tricks at you. It becomes a very difficult task to have to cover all of these weapons, and I think Tyreek Hill is going to get open, he's going to score, and he's going to be my number 2 on the week. Moving on to number 3, Julio Jones, playing against the Carolina Panthers defense. Julio, even though he didn't have an incredible week last week, 9 targets, 3 receptions, 79 yards, that's not great. We don't want that, but the thing is, Marshawn Lattimore pretty much has Julio's number. So, next time they play against the Saints, it's unfortunate, but Julio's got to take a dip there. But when we look at the cornerbacks of the Carolina Panthers, there really isn't enough talent here to, needlessly say, kind of reduce the ranking of Julio Jones. There really isn't too much talent in the secondary. There is a reason why this defense just gets burnt all the time. They're not good in the run game. When they have to support the run even more, play action opens up, and a guy like Julio Jones in this week's matchup is going to be set for a pretty good number here. We saw Devonta Adams last week really dominate the secondary and just pretty much impose his will on, number 47? I don't even remember what his last name is, but he got worked all night. So either way, as of right now, Julio Jones, a pretty big play. He's my number 3 on the week. Moving into number 4, we have DeAndre Hopkins playing against the Ravens secondary. Now, he's going to have a lot of probably he's going to be double covered for majority of the game. Whether it's Humphreys, whether it's Peters, whether it's Earl Thomas over the top, somebody's going to double team him and make sure that DeAndre Hopkins cannot be the key offensive weapon that wins the Houston Texans this game. They're going to force Deshaun Watson to feed it to other targets. Now, if Will Fuller comes back, as I anticipate him to do, that's great. He still has Darren Fells. They still have, the Duke Johnson out of the backfield. But I do think, comparatively to the top 3 receivers above him, he has the toughest matchup of the group. But I still think a guy like DeAndre Hopkins is a talented enough wide receiver that despite the matchup will be able to produce. Therefore, he's my number 4. Moving on to number 5, Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper he's been playing out of his mind. And is that a surprise? Not really. But at an extent, it is. Because the amount of injuries and the amount of times that he's questionable during a week makes you think, man, this guy's really beat up. But then he'll come out and have over 100 yards and have a touchdown. and just continue to produce for these Dallas Cowboys and continue to have good games. This coming week takes on Detroit's defense. Detroit's defense really can't stop a soul. Even through the air at times, Darius Slay will probably be guarding him. But I do think, a guy like Amari Cooper is too talented, and this offense is, they're clicking at times. They got to clean some stuff up, but eventually they'll get on track. And I think this is going to be another big week for Amari. He's my number 5 on the week. Moving on to number 6, Mike Evans. Mike Evans, even though he didn't have an incredible week last week, in terms of, the target count and all that, we expected that to go down. I was mentioning it, right? Even last week, he had like 17 targets, 12 targets, 16 targets. Having that kind of production and opportunity is unsustainable. It does not happen in the National Football League that you're going to be targeted that many times. And he took a little bit of a dip this past week. Only 6 targets, 4 receptions, 82 yards. Still not a terrible game. Surpassed 10 fantasy points and half PPR. Kind of did his job at the baseline. But again, we want bigger, points of production. And I think Mike Evans can deliver that this week against the New Orleans Saints. Now, I know, Marshawn Lattimore was able to lock down a guy like Julio Jones. But Marshawn Lattimore, he dealt with some injuries last week. And Mike Evans in his career has been able to take advantage of the Marshawn Lattimore one-on-one matchup and at times very much so dominate him in the passing game. So there's always a possibility that Mike Evans has a big step-up week here as my number 6 wide receiver. Moving on, Chris Godwin. When we talk about Mike Evans, not far behind is Chris Godwin. Unfortunately, Chris Godwin has been that baseline wide receiver for the last 3 weeks, like I was mentioning with Mike Evans. That's not the greatest thing. Obviously, 10 fantasy points, we'll take it. But again, we want to see more and more production. Hopefully, this is the week in terms of what the Tampa Bay Buccaneers can enforce or attack in terms of exploiting this defense. It's not going to be in the running game. We already heard Bruce Arians say that Ronald Jones is going to get more work in the passing game this week because they know for a fact it is going to be extremely difficult to run on the New Orleans Saints defense. This is going to be a pass-heavy game from the side of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense, and I really do believe this has got to be another week where you got to start Chris Godwin, and you got to wait until he breaks out again because it's coming. It eventually will be there, and hopefully this is the week. He's my number 7. Moving on to number 8, Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp, had a goose egg week. It happens. That's the National Football League. There are some players that just won't show up on a week. Only had 4 targets, which is a little bit concerning. But I think this offense is going to... thinking of this offense, right? They're going to be down 2 offensive linemen. Todd Gurley can't run the ball. Jared Goff is a mess. All they can do is pass the ball. And that's probably what's going to happen. It's going to be led to a lot of third downs, and it's going to be a lot of passes, short, probably near the line of scrimmage. Probably going to go to Cooper Kupp. Probably going to either go to him, Gerald Everett, and then, Robert Woods in that specific order. But I do think Cooper Kupp will be fine. His value is inherent because of the fact that he's going to see a lot of targets from Jared Goff. There is not going to be another week where he drops a goose egg. If it does, so be it. But I am more inclined to believe that we're going to see, a big 10-target week from Cooper Kupp going forward, probably every single week because of how bad this offense has been, and he should be fine. He's my number 8 on the week. Moving on to number 9, Julian Edelman. Julian Edelman, pretty good wide receiver. Coming off a bye week, going into a pretty good matchup. Julian Edelman, as of right now, has only had 2 performances in the first 9 weeks of less than 10 fantasy points. That's a pretty good number of production. The guy continues to see a great amount of targets just in the last 4 weeks, from weeks 6 through 9, 15, 12, 11, and 11. Those were his target counts in this offense. They're not going anywhere with the absence of a Josh Gordon gone, and the offense that is probably going to struggle against this front 7 of the Eagles because of how good they are at stopping the run. Julian Edelman is going to be utilized heavily in the passing game, as he usually is. In a PPR setting, he's incredible. In a half PPR setting, he gets the job done as a wide receiver too. But as of right now, I think because of how good this matchup is, he's going to be elevated and have a big week. He's my number 9 on the week. Moving on, let's talk about Keenan Allen as my number 10 wide receiver playing against the Kansas City Chiefs. Keenan Allen, it's trending in the right direction. We are seeing better and better weeks as we progress to a point where we can continue to trust Allen a little bit more. 3 out of the last 4 weeks, he has had 10-plus targets, which is absolutely fantastic because the 3 weeks prior to that, we saw nothing. We saw 5, 6, and 6. So hopefully we can get back on track. Hopefully we can see some red zone targets go in his direction. This is my issue. This team is running the ball heavily, all right? when you run the ball heavily, when you get down to the red zone, you typically just forget about passing to your top wide receiver because you don't need it. Also, against the Raiders, we saw 2 formations in which they brought in Hunter Henry, Lance Kendricks, Watt, the fullback, and they had Melvin Gordon in the backfield. So Kendricks, Watt, and Hunter Henry were the 3 wide receivers in the formation. What are we doing? Why don't you have Mike Williams and Keenan Allen on the goal line catching passes? I just don't understand it at times. But you know what? This offense is still trying to figure it out with their new coordinator, and hopefully we'll be able to figure it out with Keenan Allen. I think he'll have a good week. He's usually pretty good against Kansas City, and can step up to the challenge at hand. All right, moving on. Let's talk about DJ Chark. Chark, coming off a bye week with Nick Foles at quarterback, the question is going to remain: is he going to see as many targets as he did with Gardner Minshew? There are many games with Minshew in which he saw 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 targets in the game, which really made the biggest difference for him. Now, the question remains, is a guy like Chark going to be able to step up, have big performances? I think he's going to. I think from what Nick Foles has seen in the last couple weeks, he's probably at least he's been able to at least witness what these guys are capable of. So he doesn't just continue to just check down the ball to Dede Westbrook and or Leonard Fournette. So hopefully Chark's involvement in this offense doesn't disappear. Hopefully he's seeing his 8, 9, 10 targets on a single week. And I think that's where this offense is going to go. So I'm hoping DJ Chark this week has himself a big performance. Obviously, the Indianapolis Colts defense is not an easy matchup, and they have yet to take on this defense this year. But I expect it to be a pretty fun back and forth, higher scoring event, and DJ Chark should be good. Moving on. The Thursday night matchup will include Juju Smith-Schuster as well as James Conner. He's healthy. He should be ready to go. But Juju Smith-Schuster, in terms of his challenges, playing against Jalen Ramsey, like we anticipated last week, was not going to be a walk in the park. In fact, it was a walk down memory lane of just how good Jalen Ramsey is. I mean, Jalen Ramsey it will lock you down and will not let you get any air. And that's unfortunately what happened to Juju Smith. Now, that being said, they take on the Browns. They take on Cincinnati the following week, then the Browns again, then the Jets. I mean, this is going to be an easy slate of games for Juju rest of season. This is a 5-4 football team after starting 0-3 and losing to 4 good teams. If you guys don't remember, this Pittsburgh Steelers team lost to the Patriots, they lost to the Seahawks, they lost to the 49ers, and they lost to the Ravens. All 4 teams that could potentially be in the AFC and NFC championship games this year. Just put that in perspective. They have lost to good teams. The rest of the teams that they've beat, the 5 other games, they fought hard. They beat some good teams there. So they beat some bad teams, but they competed and they beat some teams. The following games are against some, bottom tier teams. They could really make a playoff run, and it starts with Juju getting more usage in the offense. Hopefully Mason Rudolph can funnel target this guy, because that's really what they need to do in the passing game. And that's why he sits at number 12 going into Thursday night's matchup. Moving on, let's talk about my wide receiver twos on the week. Talking about DJ Moore. DJ Moore was on the list twice last week. Not by accident, but sometimes by accident. DJ Moore did exactly what I guess he was emphasized to do. I had him twice on the list. Therefore, he was supposed to be a monster. It was an accident. It happens. But either way, DJ Moore continuing to see more targets in the last, 5 games of the year. 8 targets, 10 targets, 9 targets, 10 targets, 11 targets. DJ Moore is getting more use in the last 2 weeks, has surpassed 100 receiving yards in both games. Now, you may be thinking, Andrew, he doesn't have the upside play because he never catches the touchdown. Now, I get it. They have Christian McCaffrey. They have Curtis Samuel. Those are the 2 guys that are primarily their touchdown fiends, and you can't do anything about it. But getting 10-plus targets, back-to-back weeks, 100-plus yards, back-to-back weeks, then going into the Atlanta Falcons matchup, it's far too favorable, and I really do believe DJ Moore is going to have a good week here. He's my number 13. Moving on to number 14, Jamison Crowder, a guy that is really he flew under the radar this season, and he's flying right into my lineup every single week because Jamison Crowder, he gets the job done. Whether it's, what's crazy? Jamison Crowder gets the job done on the first drive of the game, and then he disappears. That's really what happens. In the last 2 weeks, 80-plus receiving yards both games and a receiving touchdown in both games. He'll show up on the first drive. He'll catch the ball 5 times for 60 yards, and he'll score a touchdown, and he's like, all right, I'm done, ladies and gentlemen. I'll see you guys next week. And he leaves. That's all I want. That's all I want to see. I mean, going back to what we saw in week 1, these are better. I mean, these are more consistent performances because we're seeing more target counts. But again, this is probably the only wide receiver that I can trust in this offense, and he's been very good. And he plays against Washington. A lot of excitement for the matchup this week for Jamison Crowder. He should be good. He's my number 14. Moving on to number 15, John Brown. All right, John Brown. You've disappointed me in the last couple weeks. Am I surprised that you've disappointed me? Yes, because I thought playing against Philadelphia, playing against Washington, playing against Cleveland would be fun for you, and you would have easy games. But unfortunately, that has not been the case. The last time the Buffalo Bills played against the Miami Dolphins, John Brown had a 16.8 point week in half PPR, scored a touchdown, 80 plus receiving yards, had a good game. But the way it looks is that the Miami Dolphins are out here trying to win games. They're out here trying to really play upset special. And there could be a week where perhaps they lock down John Brown or they really get after this offense and make it struggle. That's why John Brown sits at 15. I think he's still going to have a good game. I think the floor of 10 points is typically there, but the upside is what I'm going and hoping for. And I think he can probably reach that. But either way, he sits at number 15 because Miami looks like they don't want to throw games anymore. So either way, John Brown 15. Moving on to number 16, Mohamed Sanu. Mohamed Sanu, last time we saw him out, just as many targets as Edelman, just as many receptions as Edelman, got himself a receiving touchdown. Mohamed Sanu in this matchup against the Eagles should be easy. The Eagles secondary has not been good all year. This is a guy that is going to be probably the number 1 outside receiver for this offense going forward. And either way, is probably, outside of James White, Edelman, the next favorite target in terms of Tom Brady's, hierarchy of who am I passing the ball to. So I think this week I have a lot of confidence in this offense coming off the bye week, being able to exploit the secondary. And I expect Mohamed Sanu to have a pretty good game here as my number 16 wide receiver. Moving on to number 17, Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley, again, takes a pretty big step forward because of the absence of Hooper and the absence of Mohamed Sanu and Devonta Freeman this week. If this team wants to win the game, they have to run the ball with Brian Hill, certainly, but they also need to utilize their best 2 wide receivers, Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones. I expect Julio Jones to have a big week. Calvin Ridley, on the other hand, hasn't had a huge week this year. Last year, we saw Calvin Ridley score a bunch of touchdowns in the red zone. This was a guy that was consistently finding value from touchdowns. This year hasn't even come close to that, and I think that's mainly because of this offense struggling at times. But again, we'll figure that. I mean, also it's Austin Hooper. Austin Hooper has been killing in the red zone for this offense. But regardless, there is no more Austin Hooper. Hopefully Calvin Ridley can be that guy. He's my number 17 of the week. All right. Now, let's talk about a little bit of Jarvis Landry, shall we? Jarvis Landry plays on Thursday at home. Jarvis Landry, back-to-back weeks, great performances, and is really becoming the number 1 wide receiver of this team. Sure, maybe Odell gets more targets, but in the last 3 weeks, 10 targets, 13 targets, 10 targets. This guy has scored touchdowns in back-to-back weeks and is contributing heavily to this offense to an extent to where I'm thinking, well, Jarvis Landry right now finally getting to where I expected him to be at the beginning of the season. Finally, they're realizing if I can't feed number 13, I might as well give Landry the ball because he is a good all-pro wide receiver. Finally, he's getting his due. And this week's matchup, it's not great, but I do expect it to be decent. And I expect Jarvis Landry to have another good week because if you're going to get 10 targets and you're going to catch the ball, 70+% of the time, you're going to have production and you're going to be good. And I expect Jarvis Landry to do that. And therefore, he's my number 18. Moving on to number 19, Michael Gallup. Gallup continues to be good, continues to find the end zone and be a very good contributor for this offense in his second year. Has really stepped up. Even with Randall Cobb having a huge game, it didn't really affect Michael Gallup that much. He continues to see a good streamline of targets, finds himself in the end zone, and continues to be of service to this offense to a pretty good margin. This coming week plays against the Detroit defense. Again, another one of these defenses that can't stop a soul. And I think Michael Gallup in line for another big week here in terms of fantasy. He's my number 19. Moving on to number 20, Courtland Sutton. Now, Courtland Sutton sits a little bit lower, even though Minnesota's been awful against wide receivers. Courtland Sutton sits a little bit lower because the uncertainty of how good Brandon Allen could be. If Brandon Allen can continue to come out and put up good performances and feed Courtland Sutton the ball, then we have no problem having him even higher. But as of right now, a mid to late or mid to end tier wide receiver 2, that's where I have him as a comfort level in terms of where I expect them to be. Now, this coming week's game, is it in Denver or is it in, where are we at? Week 11. It is in Minnesota. So it's going to be a little tough, but I expect Courtland Sutton as the number 1 wide receiver of this team, who is going to see probably a similar amount of targets that he did, whether it was with Joe Flacco or not, to have himself another good week. This is a guy that is just stepping up and playing out of his mind this year, and he should be good on this week as my number 20 wide receiver. Excuse me. All right, moving on. Deebo Samuel. I expect Emmanuel Sanders to miss, potentially, George Kittle, and maybe even Matt Breida. If all those guys are down, Deebo Samuel would be the number 1 wide receiver. He would be playing against a defense that has struggled against quarterbacks, and just a couple weeks back allowed Emmanuel Sanders to go over 100 receiving yards against a guy like Patrick Peterson. So I think Deebo Samuel, who also had 100 yards himself this past week in Seattle, could have a very good week. Obviously, there are a lot of mouths to feed. Also, there are a lot of injury news that we have to go ahead and see. If George Kittle comes back, it'll definitely hurt him. But either way, I do expect Deebo Samuel to be a good wide receiver 2 on the week. He sits at my number 21 at this moment in time. Moving on to number 22, Tyrell Williams, playing against Cincinnati's defense. Again, this will be the Josh Jacobs show, but Tyrell Williams should come in, should have a good performance for the first time in a couple weeks. Again, Tyrell Williams is very much so touchdown dependent in order to get his big performances. That's why we've kind of seen him kind of fizzle out in a couple weeks. But again, we should see some reemergence and re-establishment in this week's offense against Cincinnati in Oakland. All right, moving on, Marquise Brown, another good matchup. He's playing against the Houston Texans defense. Now, really quickly, I kind of want to see this. How many targets did Marquise Brown have last week? Because it kind of makes a pretty big difference in my eyes in terms of what kind of usage he's getting. Yeah, look, this is what concerns me, okay? Having 4 targets, 4 receptions, sure. He had 80 yards and a touchdown, 16 fantasy points in half PPR. That's great. But the week before had 4 targets, 3 receptions for 48 and no touchdowns. Ended up with 6 points. There is a 10-point swing that could happen. That could, really just, I was going to say ream your team, but that rhymed too much. I really think Marquise Brown's a little sketchy play. That's why I have him as like a fringe wide receiver too. If you want to take the risk and play the upside, perfectly fine. But you got to be careful, even despite how good the matchup is potentially. Moving on, Odell Beckham Jr. sits at my number 24. If you're going to see 12 targets and you're going to play against a defense that probably doesn't have a Tre'Davious White, Joe Hayden's good, but he's not anything of that talent level. I think Odell Beckham could have a good week. The coming weeks could be good for Odell. You play against Pittsburgh. If you have a good game, that's fantastic. Then you play against Miami. Then you play against Pittsburgh again. There could be some good games in his coming future, potentially. But either way, he sits at this wide receiver 24 spot as the fringe play. Moving on, number 25, Terry McLaurin. Plays against the Jets defense. Hopefully, it's all up to Dwayne Haskins. It really is. The value of Terry McLaurin will 100% be dictated by Dwayne Haskins, so we'll see exactly what kind of value he is going to be able to capture this week, depending on the talent of the quarterback position. Moving on, number 26, Curtis Samuel. Similar to a guy like DJ Moore, this has been a very consistent wide receiver group in the last couple of weeks, and we're getting to a point where Curtis Samuel is the touchdown guy. DJ Moore is the targets and reception guy, but if, in fact, Curtis Samuel is going to continue to see the amount of targets, 3 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks, playing against Atlanta's defense, and the following week gets New Orleans, then Washington, then Atlanta, then Seattle, then Indianapolis. It's going to be some fun matchups, and I think Curtis Samuel is a good play this week as my number 26 wide receiver. Moving on, let's talk about Robert Woods. Like I was mentioning earlier, the Rams offense is going to have to pass the whole game, whether it's Kupp, Everett, Reynolds, Woods. I expect Woods to be a little bit better this week, similar to last week. Had a good amount of targets. Probably going to have to do similar numbers. He's going to have to contribute heavily in order to help this offense do anything. They could potentially lose this week in LA, but regardless of that, Woods should be a pretty decent play on the week with a good amount of targets. Moving on to number 28, Will Fuller. I expect him to play this week. Coming off injury, hasn't played for like a month, but he plays against the Ravens defense. That's tough. That's definitely not a fun little secondary to play against. That is in the last couple of weeks, they've scored touchdowns defensively every single week, and this is a defense that's going to get after it. This is an offense that is going to put a lot of points on you. So the question is it going to be Deshaun Watson coming back in the second half? And that's typically what his game plans look like. So hopefully, Will Fuller can get some usage this week. Coming off the injury, he can stay healthy, and for the coming weeks, be a pretty decent wide receiver play for this team. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Kenny Golladay. Kenny Golladay with Jeff Driscoll should be fine. I know they play against the Dallas Cowboys. They've been playing well in terms of their secondary, but again, it only takes a couple catches. Driscoll's not that bad of a quarterback. Kenny Golladay, been an elite wide receiver. If in fact Matthew Stafford plays, obviously Kenny Golladay would be like a top 16 wide receiver play, but that's not the case right now. So we leave him at 29, and I'm confident with him there. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up the last couple players here on the 30 through 36 section of this list. Number 30, Christian Kirk. Yes, Christian Kirk came off a 3-touchdown game, monster week, but he plays against the 49ers secondary, and that's not going to be easy, not one bit. So I think somebody asked me earlier this week, should I sell high on Christian Kirk? You absolutely can. You could potentially go out, see exactly what you're being offered for his talent. Maybe somebody is more confident in him than I am and wants to buy him off of you. But like looking at their upcoming schedule, they have a bye week in 12. Obviously, in week 11, they play against San Francisco, which a couple weeks back only caught the ball twice for 8 yards. Not an easy matchup. Gets the Rams. Jalen Ramsey's going to be guarding him. Gets Pittsburgh, probably will get double teamed by Minka and Joe Hayden. Then gets Cleveland. That's a decent matchup in week 15. Week 16, decent matchup against Seattle again. Those aren't bad. But again, doesn't have an easy slate going forward. I know Kyler Murray's been stepping up, but again, this is not something, I don't know. I'm just a little weary on it. That's why he sits at number 30 this week regardless. Moving on to 31, Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs sits at number 31 because Chris Harris Jr. Now, you may be thinking, well, isn't Stefon Diggs a good wide receiver? Well, yeah, if Adam Thielen's on the field or if they're playing against a bad secondary. But just talking about what Chris Harris Jr. has allowed to opposing wide receivers. Odell Beckham only caught the ball 5 times for 87 yards, okay? If you want that, that's perfectly fine out of, Stefon Diggs. A wide receiver 3, 10 points, no problem. But he locked down T.Y. Hilton. He, pretty much bottled up Tyreek Hill as much as he possibly could. He didn't let Corey Davis do anything this year. Keenan Allen barely got more than 18 receiving yards. DJ Chark was locked down. Devontae Adams was locked down. Allen Robinson was locked down. I mean, Chris Harris Jr. locks down everyone. And it's going to be no surprise when he does it again this week to a guy like Stefon Diggs. Moving on. Sammy Watkins, 9 targets. That's promising. Perfectly promising. Just need to see him catch a touchdown. I need a 10-point week from Sammy Watkins. Until we see it, he sits at the 30s range because of the potential. But we need to see a big week here. Moving on, number 33, Zach Pascal. Should be a good play this week with Jacoby Brissett coming back. The only reason I have him at 33 is because if, in fact, functions is the return, there is a chance that Zach Pascal could see less of a usage in this offense accordingly. But we'll go ahead and just, again, ranking subject change. We'll see where this goes. Moving on to 34, Tyler Boyd should be a good play this week against the Raiders defense. Again, if he's going to be the number 1 wide receiver of this team, he's going to see a good amount of targets, and he's healthy. Should be a good play. Moving on, Mike Williams playing against the the Kansas City Chiefs. The Kansas City Chiefs, again, we got to think about it like this. Kansas City Chiefs, sure, their defense has been good, but if this team gets ahead very early and forces Phillip Rivers to have to throw the ball, it's either we're going to get a 1 touchdown, 3 interception game from Phillip Rivers, or we're going to get a game in which Mike Williams is popping off for 2 touchdowns because he's typically played well against his defense. Is he going to have a huge game? I doubt it. I think he'll probably have 5 catches for 80 yards. That's pretty much where he sits. And should be decent. Moving on, let's talk about Devonta Parker. Again, like I was mentioning, the Dolphins look like they want to win. Devonta Parker is the leading guy of this offense. I've pretty much talked about every single offense and every single wide receiver for that offense. So I'm not going to miss out on a guy like Devonta Parker. He's been far too good in the last couple weeks and far too consistent in this offense. So he will get his mention. He will be my number 36. I want to thank everybody for watching. Until tomorrow, these were the wide receiver rankings for Week 12. I will see you guys on tomorrow's video. We have quarterbacks and tight end rankings. Then Friday we'll do hidden gems for sure. But until then, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace.